Recording has started.
And Daniela, the floor is
Good.
yours.
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all of you joining us from all over the world. My name is Daniela, and I'm very pleased to be welcoming you to the second day of our conference on private investment and transmission. We had a very informative session yesterday where our panelists gave us an overview of transmission investment on the continent, as well as their immediate perspective on the topic. And today we have two exciting panels. The first one being that we will evaluate the potential of the ITP approach to overcome some of the challenges highlighted on day one. And then the second panel will focus more on regulatory modifications to facilitate private investment and transmission. And before I pass the floor to our moderator, Sergio, allow me to share some housekeeping notes. Firstly, the moderators will introduce the speakers by their names, the positions and organizations, and more information on our speakers is available on the website. This will allow us to go straight into the conversation. And secondly, if time allows, moderators will take in questions from the audience. The audience can type in their questions in the Q&A box available at the bottom of their screens. The event is being recorded, and it will be made available on the ASR website. Interpretation for our French speakers is available. So please feel free to use the button available. And during today's session, we'll be watching a 10-minute video by Luis Barroso, a former director of Brazilian energy planning of a Brazilian energy planning company, who was heavily involved in transmission planning in Brazil. And the video discusses the Brazilian transmission model, as well as the role of private investment in transmission. An extended version of this video is now available on our YouTube channel, as well as our website. So we heavily encourage you to watch it. And lastly, please enjoy the session, and I'll pass the mic to our moderator, Sergio.
Thank you, Daniela, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending the first panel of the second day of the conference. My name is Sergio Porta Tadino, and I'm the technical lead of the energy work of the Tony Blair Institute in Africa, and I have the privilege to moderate the session. So the topic of this panel is the independent transmission project and the implementation of this approach in the African context. We want to discuss with our panelists if and how this business model is able to accelerate the development of the transmission network on the continent and overcome the investment challenges that our colleague discussed yesterday during the first day of the conference. As a brief method of introduction, what is an independent transmission project, an ITP? For our discussion today, we will define the ITP model as the construction and maintenance of a single transmission line or a package of lines under a long-term contract. This contract is generally signed by a utility company that will retain the coordination of the operations of the entire grid and a private company that is established to undertake the project. In a way, we can think of the ITP model as a version of the financial framework that is used by independent power producers, the IPPs, for generation. Now, this model has proved some results in regions such as India and Latin America, but not yet in Africa, where the needs for new transmission lines are huge, but resources, including concessional resources, are scarce. So there is a need to inject additional private capital to accelerate development. So today we want to explore with our panelists if this ITP model can be a solution for the continent, and if so, at which conditions. We have with me today 3 energy experts that I'm sure will make this panel a lively conversation. Let me briefly introduce them, reminding you that, as Daniela mentioned, you can find the full bios on the website of the African School of Regulation. So the first one is Luis Barroso, who's the CEO of PSR Energy Consulting and the former director of the Brazilian Energy Planning Agency. Unfortunately, Luis couldn't attend in real time, but he was kind enough to send us a video contribution that explains how Brazil could actually implement this model and the results they achieved. Then we have Ryan Ketchums, who is partner at the Hampton Andrews Court. Thank you, Ryan, for being with us today.
Thank you.
And Samuel Opana, Program Officer at the Energy Planning and Modeling Unit at AUDA NEPAD. Thank you, Samuel, as well. All right. Let's set the scene on the ITP model with a short video contribution from Luis in the case of Brazil, and please launch the video.
Hello, everyone. I'm Luis Barroso from Brazil. I'm very pleased to be with you today. Sorry, I couldn't be live in this session. I had another commitment at the same time, but I have prepared a presentation and I'll go through how Brazil has been doing transmission through private investments and for a lot of time, by the way. I am the CEO of PSR, which is a global consulting firm based in Brazil, and we do a lot of work in Africa as well on many topics related to regulation, planning, and auctions. I am the past director of the Brazilian Energy Planning Company, which was basically the entity responsible for the planning activities that supported the transmission business model that has fostered transmission investments through private participation, as I'll show to you in my presentation now. I wanted to thank you for the invitation to be here and to commend my colleague and mentor, Professor Inácio Pérez Aliaga, for all this initiative of the African School of Regulation, which is absolutely key and very important, I think, for the continent. So let me share my screen with you. There you go. Here you have my presentation, and let's go on. So the background of this talk is Brazil, the largest country in Latin America. In terms of surface area, we are equal to the continental US plus half of Alaska, and that the country is highly renewable. Out of the 200 gigawatts that we have on the generation installed capacity, 85% of it is renewable. Our chief renewable is not green, but blue, is hydro with some storage. And the other renewables are wind, solar, and bioenergy. And all the generation technologies, they have a complementarity in their production, either by complementarity on hydrological inflows, complementarity between production patterns, as in the case of wind and hydro, sun and the load, and so on. And in order to extract the value of the generation portfolio, we have a very robust transmission grid, about 200,000 kilometers of high voltage lines is the size of the grids in the country. And high voltage for us is anything greater than 230 kV. And Brazil is a very transmission-intense country. We built a lot of new transmission. So about 50,000 kilometers of new lines have been built since 2016. And there is much more coming ahead. So if you take for the next 10 years, the system expects to add some more than 40,000 kilometers of new high voltage lines, bringing a lot of new investment needs, more than $20 billion. And the drivers for the new transmission in the country are load growth, between 3 to 5% per year, renewables growth. Renewables have been dominating the new capacity additions, reliability, and more recently, flexibility and resiliency. Resiliency has been very important for the country, especially when talking about the adverse impacts of climate change on the grid, on the inflows that affects hydropower, and so on. And how do we make all these investments to happen? Simply through a model that combines planning with competition. So we do centralized transmission planning as well as the operation of the grid. But from the planning exercise through least cost transmission planning, we basically take the assets that will need to be built, and all the planning exercise is done to coordinate basically the maximization of the use of the system resources to maximize the system benefits. But once the new reinforcement needs are known, the implementation of those assets is completely decentralized. We search for efficiency through auctions. So we do transmission auctions instead of bilateral negotiations. In the auctions, they select whoever will construct and operate, deliver the operation maintenance activities of the lines. So auctions are a way to ensure the price discovery on the capex and whoever wins those auctions becomes a transmission company. And we have had a lot of private players, if not all of them are private, but with a prominent role in this business model for the past years. The institutional setting of the country that is needed for this to happen is formed by a Ministry of Energy that supplies the guidelines for policy making, an energy research office, which is the energy planning company, the one that I was a general director of for a few years ago, that does the transmission planning, the technical activities, a regulatory agency that organizes the transmission auctions and defines the contracts and all the risk sharing between the transmission companies and the government and the consumers, and a system operator that optimizes the dispatch and schedules the power flows in the lines, regardless of the ownership. So ONS, which is the Brazilian ISO, doesn't know the ownership of the assets when deciding generation dispatch and power flows in the line. So it's just a least cost generation dispatch, as we have all learned it in the classic days of studying economic dispatch. In more details, basically the logic of the transmission business model is to deliver a low-risk business environment by awarding long-term concessions through the auctions that are based on the revenue cap model. We have mainly 4 steps. So the transmission planning activities defines the assets that will be built, which are divided in lots and put up for auction. The auctions is the framework where the companies, public or private, they compete for an annual revenue stream, which is granted to build, maintain, and operate the assets. The regulator defines a price cap, and whoever offers the smallest annual allowed revenue will have the right to develop the project and becomes a transmission company. They get a 30-year concession contract. The commitment is to build, maintain, and operate the line. They are paid a fixed revenue stream starting at the asset's commercial operation date, so they can anticipate the line. If they anticipate, they get more money ahead of schedule. And it is adjusted by inflation, paid in Brazilian reais or local currency, no payments in US dollars. And we have a small tariff review every 5 years on the WACC for the financial component of the loan, but this is a very small detail. The revenues are completely independent from the actual power flows through the facility, so there is no volume risk. And there is an arrangement for risk sharing, so there are penalties for unavailabilities, penalties for failures that can adversely affect the life of the transmission company. Who pays for the transmission annual allowed revenue of the system are the grid users through a transmission use of the system tariff, which has locational components. The credit risk has been absolutely negligible due to the diversification of the payers and also due to a complex scheme of guarantees that it's implemented in the country. The regulator may unilaterally define new reinforcements, which are, again, authorized, but also remunerated through the same mechanism, only directly authorized. And at the end of the concessions, the assets revert back to the state and are re-auctioned. This model has been delivering a lot of investments, so more than 85,000 kilometers of new high voltage lines have been built for the past 16 years, delivering $40 billion in new investments. I show you in this chart the discounts with respect to the auctions cap in every year. As you can see, competition has been very fierce, and players have been delivering transmission investments with a significant discount with respect to the auction caps defined by the regulator. The bulk of the winners have been private companies. Private ownership in the transmission business is today over 90%, and we have been doing this since 1998, when Brazil moved into this deregulation process. The most common question that I get when I'm delivering this presentation, and this is my final slide, is how to guarantee that the annual annuity will be actually paid. Basically, we have a system of guarantees. There are escrow accounts that ensures that the bankability of payments is for real. And this mechanism has allowed a lot of public and private financing to come to this business as well, including the venture holders. And some of the transmission companies have even been listed in the stock exchange. We have never ever had any default on the payment for the transmission system. Does the fact that we have a private participation in transmission adversely affect the system operation? No, because the system operation is done regardless of the ownership. This is very important. And the enforcement of the penalties for unavailabilities has been very important and done in the country. And the final question, whether this scheme is efficiency or if we should be using public money to fund transmission. And it's crystal clear that this business model through the auctions and private investment has delivered much more efficiency than doing the same investment through public funds. You can easily see this by the difference between the auction caps and the actual investment delivered by the private players. So the discounts have been very significant, and the auction cap is a very good proxy for the same investment delivered from a public fund. So we are very happy with this. We don't plan to change, and we are confident that this can be a very interesting model for the African countries to have a look, to rely on private investment, to have a new transmission built with efficiency at the right pace to deliver renewable integration, reliability, resiliency, and to meet load growth. Thank you very much. Enjoy the day. And sorry I cannot be with you on the panel session for the discussion live now. I hope you have enjoyed. I'm available for any further clarifications or questions through my email listed here. Thank you.
All right, we're back. A very interesting insight from Brazil, and thanks, Luis, for sending across your contribution. Let me remind everyone that an extended edition of this video is on the YouTube channel of the African School of Regulation, and you can consult it there. But let's now focus on Africa and our two energy experts of this panel. To begin the conversation, let me ask you, Ryan and Samuel, a simple question. What is the added value of the ITP model in your opinion? Maybe Samuel, you can start, and then we will hear from Ryan. Over to you.
Thank you, Sergio, for the opportunity. And thank you for the introductory remark from Louise. At least it was informative, and we've learned one or two from it. First, as we know, is that traditional sources of finance are always not sufficient to cover the transmission infrastructure gap that we have, not only in the continent, but in the member countries. And if we can introduce a private sector participation in the development and maybe management of transmission infrastructure, we know that we can at least spur growth, not only in a private sector, but also in a public sector. We know that the private sector always brings flexibility and market-oriented approaches, which are used in the development and financing and operation of transmission infrastructure. So if for this one, we know that if we apply it in ITPs, and we know that our private sector, they normally bring innovation in each sector that they are handling. We can see that in many sectors that we have applied PPP approaches, there is some innovation which are always better than the normal public sector when they're handling projects. And if we apply, or if we allow private participation in the development and the maintenance of these transmission lines, we will be able to have a better operation, a resilient transmission infrastructure, which can even improve or increase the accessibility of electricity, not only to the to spur industrial growth, but even to the citizens of Africa who are currently not being able to access these affordable energy sources that we have in our continent. To just give a brief, is that recently AUDA, NEPAD, completed the development of the first African master plan, which is the CMP. And from it, we found that there were some critical transmission and generation projects that were identified. And from this, we know that even if we identify these transmission projects and we do not have transmission lines or transmission infrastructure to move this generated power to the load sources, then it will be like we are doing a zero work. So if we allow the ITP or the private sector to get involved in these independent transmission projects, we know that it will have a value in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. Ryan, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen for just a minute. And I would like to discuss 5 attributes of independent transmission projects that that I feel really kind of explain the value that they can deliver. The first of these is that ITPs are operated as part of an integrated transmission system and not by the project company that owns them. Louise touched on this. We touched on this yesterday. And the upshot of this is that either the state-owned transmission company or the system operator, and in Brazil, we heard that that was the national system operator, continues to dispatch the entire system. And so ITPs do not lead to a loss of control over dispatch. The second thing about ITPs that I think is very interesting is that they can be implemented in virtually any enabling environment. Particularly when you compare them to other solutions like a whole of grid concession, which requires a long list of preconditions. ITPs are just simple and easy to implement. You need a suitable licensing regime. So you need the regulator to have the ability to issue a transmission license or not. Because what you really need is clear authority by the government, by the regulator, by the transmission utility, whoever is entering into the transaction documents to award those transaction documents. You don't have to have an independent regulator. I think that they're necessary, that they're helpful, but they're not necessary here. And some countries don't have an independent regulator. The utility, the state utility can be the integrated utility. It could be an unbundled utility that better in disaggregation, as we saw a dispatch code. So they're easy to implement in most environments. The third thing is that the contractual and regulatory. So in this diagram, the project company, and that is the usually maintains the assets, is in the middle. And on the right, you have at the bottom a transmission service agreement with the state-owned utility, and at the right, a government support agreement with the host country. And we've all seen diagrams that look exactly like this. And if you just replace the transmission service agreement with a power purchase agreement, you would have a diagram for a solar IPP or a wind IPP. So this structure is familiar to everyone. And just like with an IPP, an independent power project, you have a regulator, usually, which is regulating the state-owned utility. So in the case of an IPP, that would be the off-taker. In the case of an ITP, an independent transmission project, that state-owned utility would be the transmission company that's buying the service. And maybe the regulator issues a license. So in the documents in the transmission service agreement, it contains a lot of the same concepts that a power purchase agreement would contain. So it grants the right and the obligation to construct, to own and maintain the asset. It deals with the procurement of land rights, payment obligations, technical specifications, and termination payments. Although those termination payments could be located in the government support agreement. And the government support agreement will look a lot like a government support agreement, or could look a lot like a government support agreement for an IPP. So you've got credit support and termination payments, a few other things, maybe foreign exchange, etc., in the government support agreement. The revenues are predictable, as Louise indicated, as other panelists and speakers indicated yesterday. They should take the form effectively of an annuity. And this enables the use of project financing techniques. This is important because you can lengthen tenors, you can increase debt to equity ratios, which makes these projects overall more affordable. And if you just stop and think about that for a minute, if you can get from a 50-50 debt to equity ratio that a vertically integrated utility might have to 75-25 or 80-20, there's a significant cost savings right there. And that experience was borne out in Brazil. So if the project company maintains the asset, then the project company would be paid for the availability of the asset. There are some cases, and I have mixed feelings about this, where maybe the transmission utility itself that's buying the transmission capacity maintains the asset. And if that happens, then effectively the payments are lease payment, and there's no adjustment for availability. And then finally, the market is familiar with the risk allocation. The risk allocation should look a lot like the risk allocation for an independent power project looks. The same issues come up, the same solutions are available. And if you want to see more about proposed risk allocations, they are in the position paper that ASR circulated in advance of the conference. So Sergio, thank you for bearing with me, and let me stop there.
Thank you, Ryan. This is very interesting. For the next question, I would like to go back to Samuel. Samuel, NEPAD plays a critical role in promoting infrastructure development across the continent. In your view, what are the most significant barriers to attracting private investment into power transmission? And how can regional institutions such as yours, such as NEPAD, can help overcome these barriers?
Thanks again, Sergio, and thanks, Ryan, for such a good presentation. Yes, as I had alluded earlier, is that AUDA, NEPAD, and African Union Commission recently completed the development of the first African Continental Master Plan. And with it, we also have what we call Africa Single Electricity Market, which will enable the integration of various regional power pool bodies that we have in the continent. And from the studies is that we have 5 regional bodies, that is the East African Power Pool, Southern Africa Power Pool, Central Africa Power Pool, West Africa Power Pool, and North African Power Pool. And if you look at these power pools, even between the power pools themselves, there are some countries which are not yet connected. And if you look at the 5 regional bodies that we have, most of them are not yet interconnected. And from whatever I've said is that we have, Africa has a great potential in generation capacities, be it renewable and other sources that we have. So if we can welcome private developers so that we spur IPPs in it, then it means that Africa will be able to share the great resources that they have. So let me go into the some barriers that we have or we are facing that might lock out the independent transmission projects developers in sub-Saharan Africa. One of them, and which has always been brought up by AUDA, is we lack bankable projects, and this does not entice the appetite of project developers. So if as AUDA and other regional players, if we can have proper bankable projects and projects pipeline, we know that this one can be some enticing effects to private developers or private sector, and it can help grow the ITP in Africa. Secondly, is that we have a perception about the political and the bad perception on political and economic instability that we have. So you'll find that some ITPs do not want to participate in independent transmission projects, especially which are cross-border. For example, connecting one country to another, because you'll find that one country might be stable, but the other country which is being interconnected to might be politically unstable. So this one puts away some of the developers who might be having some interests in the development of such transmission networks. As we continue, is that we have some tariff structures in Africa which are not that attractive to developers. And you'll find that these tariff structures are being promoted by the policies and the regulatory frameworks which we have in our continent and in most African countries. And you find that these regulatory and policy frameworks, they normally change depending on the regime which is in power. And if these regimes change, you'll find that now a government will call for maybe a change or a repeal in the policy. And if you know that these policies are repealed, it might not entice private developers to engage in these independent transmission projects or development. So I think those are some of the challenges that we are facing. So to spur or to at least entice these or project developers or private developers to participate in these ITPs, what are some of the things that AUDA should do or regional bodies? So one of them is that we should have or we should set up regional manufacturing units. You find that currently most of these equipment that we are using in the development of be it generation or transmission infrastructure, almost all of them are being imported. What if we have local manufacturing units within Africa? So that one will reduce even the cost of the project, because we know Africa has great potential of having these or materials or the raw materials to manufacture or to manufacture these transmission and generation equipments which are required for regional integration. Secondly, is that AUDA is planning to set up renewable energy markets. By setting up these renewable energy markets, this will give assurance to private investors to invest in transmission interconnectors, because we know that now they'll have these interconnectors to evacuate power from wherever these the sites of renewable energy are located to the load centers. So if we can have or we can promote renewable energy markets in the region, this one will entice the project or private developers. Secondly, is as I had said earlier, is that currently we lack bankable projects and projects pipeline. So AUDA and AUC are trying to develop a pipeline of bankable projects This one will be done using standardized guidelines to ensure that there is excellency in project preparation. So if project preparation is done well, this one will entice private developers to engage in these ITPs that we have. Another one is AUDA is planning to use project framework contracts to reduce procurement period from around 16 years or so to 3 to 4 years. So you'll find that if we can reduce the procurement period, which we know currently in most African countries, procurement period of this transmission infrastructure is taking a very long time. And that one might even not entice the private sector to engage in the development of these ITPs. But if we can reduce the procurement period, it means that they'll come in and they'll recoup their investment as fast as possible. That one will be a positive thing that we will be moving towards. And this one under the use of framework contracts, AUDA is using PIDA quality labels to always improve or to always mark the projects that have been identified, which are critical in the integration of our continent. And then lastly, AUDA is planning to organize the market sounding events. These market sounding events will be able to market our critical transmission infrastructure that we have. So if we will be having these events whereby we will be able to market the critical transmission infrastructure to project developers. Now, this one will help them to know which projects have high return value, which projects are connecting well the regions that we have in the continent, which projects are able to give them or recoup their investment fast. So in this way, I think in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see more participation of private developers in the development of transmission networks or infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. Thank you. Thank you. Very, very interesting. Ryan, I would like to go back to you, and I would like to ask you, in your opinion, in the context of independent transmission project model, can you discuss any novel legal or contractual strategies that can be effective in mitigating investor risk, ensuring thus financial viability of this project and reducing the final cost?
Sure, happy to. I think, yes, some novel structures are necessary, but actually there is a tremendous amount of knowledge in the market on how to mitigate these risks in the electricity sector generally. And I think many of the things that work with an IPP will work with an ITP. So as an example, if the utility that enters into the transmission service agreement does not have an investment grade credit rating, Africa do not have an investment grade credit rating. Is it bankable without an investment grade credit rating? Well, it depends on how good the credit is. Which types of investors would be interested in a long-term offtake commitment from a non-investment grade utility? That's the interesting question. If you want to attract pensions, long-term investors, patient capital, then if you don't have an investment grade rating, then some type of sovereign support or some type of third-party support from a development finance institution goes along. But I mean, we know what the solutions are. In my view, the real key to this is not complex. We know how to do this. Brazil and others have done it. They've done it beautifully. So yes, there are some novel issues that arise, but for the most part, I think the market is very familiar with the tools that are needed to get these projects through to financial close.
Thank you. So basically, if I can follow up on this question, you're saying the tools are there. The issue is the financial viability of the utility of the off-taker, and that's where the policy should focus on.
Yes, I mean that's always been the issue in many markets. That's the issue, and there are tools to address that issue. They've been addressed for a very long time, and the credit of many utilities is improving, and it's improving very quickly.
Thank you. Yes. So we have 15 minutes left on this panel, and there are a couple of questions from the audience. But before going to that, I would like to ask you a final remark to both of you, more forward-looking. So, what are both Samuel and Ryan, your top recommendation at this stage for policymakers, for investors, and stakeholders in general, to foster a more conducive environment for the growth of an independent transmission project model in sub-Saharan Africa? Samuel, you want to go first?
Sure, Sergio. Thank you. What I can say as my top priority is that as we have promoted PPP in other sectors, we should promote PPP in transmission, because we see that we have promoted private development in generation projects. We have even in distribution in other sections, but in transmission, especially in Africa, is lagging behind. So I think if we promote promote PPP in so that we bring it to ITP, then we'll promote regional integration, and in that way we will be able to foster growth with between the neighboring countries and or between the neighboring regions. And you know that from the results of CMP, it was indicating that Africa has a potential of doing a continental trade or intercontinental trade amounting to around $136 billion. So you can see that is a very huge amount. But from the gap that we were experiencing is that we need around $35 billion to develop transmission infrastructure in Africa. And as we had said, as we were starting this session, is that public finance cannot spur this growth. So we need another type of financing or other players to come in and help reduce this gap that we have in Africa. We have weak infrastructure, transmission infrastructure, and if we go at the pace that we are going with, if we just rely on public financing of these transmission lines and transmission infrastructure, we will not be able to reach this level of trade of about $136 billion that we are talking about. So I think we should promote PPP the way we are promoting in other sectors like road, water. Let us promote it again in transmission, and we will have these exchanges that we have, and we know that by doing that we will have even the cost or the affordability of power in Africa, or the cost of power in Africa will be very low, and it will be affordable by many. And apart from that, we find that if we have private developers or a private sector participating more in transmission infrastructure, we'll have accessibility of power in improving in the sub-Saharan Africa. And we know that currently we have around 600 million people who are not able to access clean and affordable energy. So if we need to do that, we should promote PPP. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Any comments on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things. I'm working on a project in a country in the Caribbean. And in that country, there is no consolidated code first enacted, then the First Amendment, then the Second Amendment, then the Third Amendment, etc. And it was fascinating because there was a law, and then the country wanted to, effectively says, the utility may enter into long-term power purchase agreements. The regulator will approve, comment on, etc., the conduct of the tender. The regulator will issue a generation license. Thank you. That was the end of it. I think that really, I mean, yeah, these things can be done in very simple ways. And then once that is done, if it even needs to be done, we are working in a country on an ITP where I don't think that any changes to the legislative framework have been made to enable that ITP. Maybe some new regulations were issued, but the underlying law, I don't think required any changes. But once you've done that, if you need to do it, develop some projects, and you need a clear request for qualifications, a clear RFP that attaches a form of transmission service agreement, a form of the government support agreement, a form of the license. Prepare the package. Think about who's going to, what are the specifications for the line, who's going to acquire the way leaves, the easements, the other rights in land. So I think just implement some of these, perhaps not in the cross-border context at first. I think certainly it's easier to gain experience within the boundaries of a single country, and then scale it from there.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. There are quite a lot of questions from our audience, and I think we only have 8 minutes left. Maybe we can pick one or two. Maybe the first one is interesting. Drawing from the video, from the example of Brazil, one of the audience asked, are these security mechanisms that have been used in Brazil, like escrow account, etc., applicable to the African development context? Mentioning the financial market and the economy in general of most African countries is not mature as the Brazilians. It was important to discuss this in details and how to manage the transition from a fully public business to maybe a semi-public and finally fully private model, if feasible, of course. Any comments on this one? Ryan?
Yeah, Sergio, I'd be happy to. Yeah, I'd be happy to start. I think that the type of mechanism that Luis explained it works in Brazil would require quite a lot of work. The UK has done similar things to support renewables, to support nuclear, to support other aspects of the energy sector. And in a nutshell, that involves creating a surcharge that every electricity consumer pays and establishing a counterparty to the support contracts, which collects that surcharge and then distributes it to the holders of those support contracts. That can be done, absolutely. Does it require a lot of effort? Yes, it does require a lot of effort. And I think importantly, that is doing that type of thing gets more complex the more disaggregated the market is. So if you're dealing with a vertically integrated utility, things are simple. If you're dealing with a broad range of generators distribution companies, loads, electricity suppliers, then taking a step like that gets increasingly more difficult. So fortunately, I think in many countries in Africa, it would be easier to implement those kinds of things than it may be in Brazil or the UK. But I still question if that's the right place to start.
Thank you. And Samuel, maybe always on the financial tariff side, there's a question from Leonard Diego. Maybe you want to take this. Leonard says the revenues of the ITP in this case are guaranteed through annuity payments. But how does the public utility recover these revenues from the consumers, users of the infrastructure? How do you structure the tariff to the users? Is it time maybe to push for a specific transmission tariff in all markets? What do you think?
Yes, thank you, Sergio. I think it is time to include transmission tariff in the tariffs that we have. Currently in Kenya, we have it introduced because we see now, for example, Kenya, we are opening up the market and we want even to include the private developers to take part in the development of these transmission infrastructure. So if we want to go the Brazil way, we need to include it, just like we have the generation tariffs and all that. If a new capacity comes in, it is included in the tariff. So even I think in the transmission, it will be good if we have a new transmission line coming in, we include some aspect of it in the tariff, so that we the entity which is responsible for collecting revenues does collection, and it is being remitted to the developer. And we can see that that one currently is happening in Kenya, and recently they are opening even the sector more, so that they can try and have more investors taking part in it. But as my colleague Ryan has said, is that most of the African countries are still vertically integrated, which gives it not easy way of welcoming ITPs. So one of the things that we need to do, or the African countries need to do, is we need to have a change in our regulatory frameworks and policies, such that we don't have these vertically integrated systems, but we make it a system which can accommodate the players, all the players in the system or in the sector, such that now we can have the growth in the ITPs.
Okay, thank you. Maybe for the last question, I will go a little bit more hands-on operational. From Katie Oxby, what is generally the role of the public sector in securing the necessary land rights? Real estate land is always important risk for private sector. Ryan, you want to take this?
Sure. I think you can do it in one of two ways. Either have the ITP, that is the project company, secure the land rights if they have the ability to exercise the right of eminent domain or expropriation. And that's a question of local law, and it can be difficult to get to a clear answer on that sometimes. Or you could have a public authority do that. I think, you know, one of the lessons that we learned from efforts to scale up projects, and I'm thinking of scaling solar, scaling wind, get fit, and other types of scaling arrangements, is that the more effort and the more work that a public authority puts into developing the project at the beginning of the process, typically the more interest you get from developers. So there are some trade-offs to be considered there.
Thank you, Ryan. I think it's time for us to conclude. It's been a fruitful conversation, and I'm grateful to our panelists for that. It's 10 a.m. Who said that Italians cannot punch the clock? So there's another interesting panel right now that will focus once again on the regulatory modification to remove these barriers. Please stay online, enjoy the rest of the conference. The floor is yours, Rita. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we are supposed to have a 10-minute break. So according to the program, so let's have a 5-minute break and start in 5 minutes at 3:05 Central European Time, 4:05 Central African Time. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think it is.
Okay, so let's meet in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rita Madeira, Africa Program Officer at the International Energy Agency. I'm truly delighted to be here, and I wanted to start by thanking the African School of Regulation and Professor Ignacio Perez Arriaga for the kind invitation. We have a very exciting topic, of course, coming halfway through the 3-day conference means that a lot of interesting insights have already been said, so we have our challenge cut out for us. But it also means that we can also make cross-references throughout or across everything that has already been said. I think we have a very exciting panel starting right now. Before I introduce the panelists and we get onto the nitty-gritty aspects of this discussion focused on regulation, I'd really like to take a step back and put this topic into context, drawing from what has already been said. And one of the key aspects of what has already been said is that significant investment in transmission is absolutely critical for a couple of reasons. And one of them is obviously to improve system reliability, to expand access, and to facilitate integration of variable renewables. Now, at the International Energy Agency, last year we looked into the detail into financing clean energy in Africa in general in a report that we did in collaboration with the African Development Bank. And one of the aspects that we looked at was precisely this topic in investing in transmission. Most African utilities report losses of 10 to 19%, with an average of 15% across the continent, and this is more than double the global average of 7%. So I cannot stress enough how upgrading, reinforcing, and expanding transmission lines is absolutely key to provide reliable electricity, expanding access, and accommodate increasing variable renewable integration, particularly in urban and peri-urban areas. We also saw and we know that historically investment in grids on the continent has been done mostly by public utilities, and investments have been largely funded by governments or with support from governments through sovereign-backed loans from multilateral development banks and other types of support. Annual investments in grids in general, this includes transmission and distribution in Africa, according to our analysis, grew only at 5% between 2019 and 2022. But under the IEA scenario that sees the continent achieve all of its energy and climate-related objectives in full and on time by 2030, investments would need to triple by then, reaching over $50 billion United States dollars. Obviously, this requires a step change in investments channeled to the grids and particularly to transmission. We know, and this has largely been said yesterday and today, that public money alone, especially in the current macroeconomic environment and public money under increased multiple pressures, will not be sufficient to match the investment requirements, and therefore private capital will be called on to take a larger role. Now, this is likely limited to the countries that have relatively well-developed power systems, stable regulatory environments, and we know, and we discussed yesterday and today, that there are a variety of options that have largely been utilized in other jurisdictions in other continents. And we just heard from the very interesting experience in Brazil with a particular focus on power transmission, independent power transmission projects. Attracting investment to this segment that has traditionally not been open to private investment requires the removal of regulatory barriers and an understanding of this type of asset class, both in terms of investment and, as Professor Ignacio mentioned yesterday, in terms of its infrastructure and operational requirements. As Professor Ignacio mentioned, this is a natural monopoly, and effective regulations so reflects this nature. So in order to open the floodgates of private investment into this segment, it is really critical to understand regulatory design and interventions in this space, which is precisely the topic of this panel today. So how regulatory design can make or break private investment into transmission, and linking to issues that have already been raised as well in deep-rooted assumptions on the role of public utilities in this space, and linked to the security and quality of service concerns, and how this can sometimes be of a blurred distinction between ownership and maintenance of a ring-fenced asset versus the operation of the system. Now, to really deep dive into all of these topics, I have a wonderful panel with me today. Rhoda Limbani-Mshana, Chief Energy Sector Regulation Specialist at the African Development Bank. Peter Twesigie, Lead Researcher, Power Market Reforms and Regulations of the Power Futures Lab, University of Cape Town. And Harold Obiga, Director of Legal Services of the Electricity Regulatory Authority of Uganda. Rhoda, I would like to start with you. I understand that you have some camera issues, but I hope we can hear loud and clear. And to kick off this discussion, I would like to ask you if you can let us know a little bit about the challenges that you see facing regulators in Africa in this regard.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Maybe Rita, give me a thumbs up. Can you all hear me?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. So I think, we've had a lot of very interesting conversations over the past 2 days. So I don't want to repeat what my other colleagues have said, but in terms of what we've experienced and what I have personally worked with the regulators on. So we have been fortunate enough to actually work with independent regulators in 43 countries on the continent. And I think for me, the main issue is really around institutional capacities and governance frameworks. I think that's one of the big challenges that we're facing. We discussed yesterday that this is considered a kind of nascent segment, right? We have been focusing, the data is there. We have been focusing on investment in generation, as opposed to transmission and distribution. So I think for us to actually move forward in terms of transmission investment, which is critically and unarguably important, especially to achieve all of the objectives that you already highlighted, we do need to see how we can bring in additional financing within this sector. And so, for us, what we see is the challenges around institutional capacity. In terms of, so through the bank's efforts and research with working with the different regulators, we've actually identified institutional capacity as a big issue. Most of our regulators were established post the existence of our vertically integrated utilities. And so they're already coming from a back foot. And so, they have now had to catch up with generation. So the issue is they need to now start focusing. We need to prioritize, and it needs to be a prioritization from both the policy level as well as the regulatory level in terms of ensuring that we have the right understanding. The critical keys, as has already been discussed, is economic regulation and follow-up, making sure that we understand how we are pricing these projects, how we are setting up the methodologies for the tariffs, how we are actually doing the cost allocations over each of these IPTs.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rhoda, for kicking us off. Very, very good insights on especially on institutional capacity and governance frameworks. I think on what you said, and I'll segue into Peter, because one of the key questions that we have when talking about this topic is, okay, but what about market design? And this was mentioned before, and there is a majority of vertically integrated utilities on the continent. So what would you see as key to happen in market design to foster this even more, Peter?
Thank you. Thank you, Rita. And just drawing on the previous speakers and what Rhoda just mentioned, I think over the continent, we're seeing still vertically integrated power market. We see majority of utilities are still vertically integrated with single buyer model. And what's happening, what the trend we are seeing is that with the energy transition, there is still increasing pressure of unbundling these power systems and trying to create more liberalization through open access to the grid for the distribution companies, but also for the C&I and allowing IPPs to actually contract directly with DISCOs and several consumers, which is a good move towards this market liberalization. The challenge that regulators are grappling with is how to regulate this kind of transition, how these bilateral contracts being signed between IPPs and maybe consumers need to be monitored and supervised so that the costs they impose on the transmission networks are actually adequately remunerated. And this goes in contrast with the traditional mechanism of regulation that has been practiced on the continent, which is really trying to award wheeling charges to incumbent transmission system operators. And we think that that's quite erroneous. I think if you look at the allocative efficiency objective of regulation, which requires that tariff should be set to reflect the marginal cost of doing business, transmission companies have almost zero marginal costs. If you transmit an extra 1 megawatt flow into a transmission cost, we don't generate incremental losses. And therefore, regulators have not yet fully understood this challenge. And therefore, there is need to actually revise the pricing methodologies so that pricing reflects the sustainability objective, where the huge fixed cost of a transmission monopoly are actually rewarded in accordance with the weighted average cost of capital. And that is also reflected in the financial mechanism of the regulator and incumbent system operators. Yeah, I think in brief, that's how I can summarize it, but I think there is a huge need to revise the pricing mechanism of regulating transmission companies. And where wheeling mechanisms are being mentioned and developed, I think wheeling is quite an erroneous way of rewarding transmission system because it doesn't provide for remuneration of the huge fixed monopoly costs of the transmission system.
Sorry, Rita, could I just come in quickly?
Absolutely.
Before?
I was going to.
Yeah, I just wanted to build off of what Peter was saying, which was quite interesting. And it's one of the things that actually came out quite clearly in the discussions and engagements we've had with the regulators and also the utilities, is that this whole issue of cost allocation is a very big deal. So it really needs to be looked at. I think it's one of the top issues is the cost allocation. And how do we ensure that transmission is covered as its own segment vis-a-vis generation? And in most of the countries that we have assessed, transmission is actually not factored because they take it de facto that it's on the public sector budget. And that is problematic.
Thank you for coming in with that, Rhoda. And I think also some utilities also face the issue that since they're vertically integrated and there's not necessarily an accounting separation in terms of different services, it's very difficult to have a clear sense of how much of the services cost in terms of the segment. But I would like us now to go to Harold. We're talking a lot about regulatory challenges, and so I'd like to hear from the regulator amongst us. Perhaps Harold, maybe just to link with what Peter and Rhoda just said in terms of the cost allocation and the pricing methodology. Maybe I would like to hear your thoughts on that specifically, and then maybe talk a little bit broader in terms of the type of interventions that, from your perspective, would then enable IPT projects on your country.
Okay. Thank you, Rita. First is really on the interventions that you want to see at the end of the day. I think one of the things IPTs actually build upon is on an already existing robust framework for cost allocation, which means at the end of the day, irrespective of the segment in the electricity sector, are they able to actually recover their revenues? Now, and it can be done in a multiple number of ways to think through, but that is the confidence upon which IPTs should then be able to specifically ride as a sector, because that gives the confidence to the private sector that at the point at which they actually come into your market, they can then recover their costs fully. We are fortunate as a country that Uganda, we've been able to do this relatively quite well in the distribution segment, generation, and we are moving gradually to that in the transmission segment, more or less fully. But how would a regulator do this? One of the things a regulator can begin to do is actually begin to look into the costs of the transmission sector on a quarterly basis, on a yearly basis, and also on, say, every 5-year or 3-year basis, so that you begin to build credibility in understanding what are the actual drivers of cost. Because, say, if you're going to do an IPT, and then the private sector hands it over to the national utility company, who is the transmission company, what will be the benchmarks that you're going to use specifically when you're looking at that specific IPT? What are going to be the operation and maintenance costs that you want to be aware of? So you're then able to build upon that and understand transmission, and not just consistently look at it as a black box fundamentally. But if you allow me, Rita, I would like to very briefly share on some of the regulatory interventions that we have seen in our market that have specifically brought us towards an IPT market and presentation specifically. Now, what I'm sharing with you is a basic idea on how the Uganda's IPT sector is couched to run. So as was mentioned earlier, for most of the countries, you'll find there is probably an enabling framework. In our case, the Electricity Act already had an enabling framework, but we had not yet fully operationalized it. We had not yet broken it down into what does this mean legally? What does this mean economically? What does this mean financially? And what does this mean technically? So in our second generation reforms, which we are building upon the previous successes, we've then been able to break that up and come up with specific regulations. And you may ask yourself, why regulations? Regulations tend to bring a certain level of certainty to the market. Who will you contract with? What are the allocations that are required? What are the technical specifications? Who are the key parties that you're going to look at? In our case, you have a number of entities. You have the Electricity Regulatory Authority as one of the key entities, and then you also have the UETCL, who is both our HVTG licensee, bulk supplier, and transmission licensee. And you may ask yourself why, because currently all these are bundled into one at the point of transmission. The reason being, you need a certain level of checks and balances. So for instance, in our case, ERA, who is the regulator, is under the Act is allowed to invite bids for all manner of licenses. And that is why you have the Electricity Regulatory Authority here. But you understand that at the end of the day, ERA is not the one who's going to contract. So you need the transmission system operator, who is also the bulk supplier, to be able to sign a transmission service agreement with the IPT when they come in. Now, the reason why, and also in terms of procurement, in our case, what we are looking at is, so ultimately you'll get a license from ERA. And the reason why you have the license is to guarantee you the payments in terms of how are the costs going to be allocated. So the final tariff methodology will be reflected both in the transmission service agreement and then also the the HVTG license. That will give you certainty in terms of cost recovery as an IPT, who's going to pay. And why is that also critical? In our case, we are looking at transmission licenses not getting paid out, say, from the private licenses in transmission, not getting paid by the Treasury. But the sector should be able to absorb their costs fully and competitively. Reason being that any changes and also that gives the private actor quite good certainty in terms of the payment of his costs over the 20-year period or the 30-year period. Now, we will also apply that to two kinds of projects. We're applying that to both greenfield projects and also applying it to brownfield projects. In your comments, in your introductory comments, Rita, one of the things you mentioned is why do we go IPT? Governments are strained, but there are also so many different considerations. It may be power pool considerations. It may be reliability considerations. It may be strengthening the grid. It may be network considerations. So because of those hosts of considerations, you then have someone who has to make a decision. For instance, if we need to strengthen the grid in particular areas specifically to improve our transmission capacity, that probably means we're looking at a brownfield of sorts. So we're going to apply it both to already existing brownfield projects, like say substations, and then also new point-to-point lines. And that is important because, for instance, you want to be able to address, ultimately, you're looking at the question of, in terms of the transmission sector, what is my real need? Is my real need power connection? Is my real need improved reliability? Is my real need distribution efficiency, so that you can make an appropriate response? And that response will either be a greenfield or will be a brownfield response. Now, while we think and pause at that, it's important to think through that. Of course, an IPT very much mimics an IPP. However, when it comes to the nitty-gritties, the lines are not that clear-cut, and it can take a bit of understanding in terms of risk allocation to actually think through some of these specific issues to see that ultimately the right party meets the right risk and has the right obligation. Now, depending on the project, you may need an interconnection agreement or you may need a direct agreement. You may need an interconnection agreement if two IPTs are possibly interconnecting and ultimately they are connecting to the utility agreement. If the IPT is connecting directly to the transmission utility, who is the system operator, you may not need an interconnection agreement. And then you also may need a direct agreement, or you may not need a direct agreement or a support agreement. The point is, at the end of the day, as a regulator, you want to play out with a number of different scenarios to deal with your ultimate investment need. For us as a sector, what we are looking at is for this 2.5 billion that we need to invest in the electricity sector between now and the future, where are we going to get the money? And how is this going to be funded? So the private sector and the IPT is just one of those. The others being the PPP and the others being the regular public finance schemes that we have in the governments of Uganda and in the sector. So ultimately, you're looking at a multiplicity of solutions, but for the private sector, when it comes to IPT, I think one of the confidences you have to be able to give them is almost that same confidence that you'd give an IPP, that at the end of the day, they are going to recover their costs from the end user tariff. Now, because ordinarily you are making a change to a system which has been known by the sector, by the country, you also as a regulator need to be quite sensitive to this. So when we are thinking through our benefit, what is the ultimate benefit that we are looking at? So in our case, what we are thinking of is applying this to what we typically call tariff neutral projects. For instance, they are solving a very big constraint in transmission. They may be solving a very big issue in evacuation. And the cost of having the private sector do it is the private sector will do this in 1 to 2 years. Government could probably do this in 5 years. And by the time government does it, it has significantly costs. And all these things have to be thought through so that there is acceptability of IPTs. Now, ultimately, because you have all these parties, it's important that all these parties are on the same page. And I think that's what also Rhoda talked about, the need for capacity building. No one party knows it all. And this is a highly consultative and a highly dedicated process that comes with mutual understanding and seeing that the interests of the government are met, the interests of the regulator are understood, the private sector, the lenders, and then the national utility, as you make various changes and various tweaks to the regulations that you may have in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harold, for this very comprehensive, insightful presentation. I think one of the key points that you mentioned many, but I think the certainty and the credibility of building a track record, and then the certainty of understanding what drives costs is key to lowering the risk perception, and the risk to attract investors is really critical. And I would like to hear both Peter and Rhoda on the risks specifically, because we see the parallels between the IPP and the IPT model. As Harold just mentioned, there are obviously some differences. So in your view, what are the key risks that need to be addressed to increase IPT? Maybe Rhoda, to you first.
Thank you very much. I think, so building off, I think Harold actually set the stage perfectly. I think some of the challenges from what we've seen from the AFDB is the risks that are there, is the challenges in terms of looking at it in the traditional manner when you're managing or regulating the power sector. So in terms of transmission as a segment within the value chain, it hasn't been prioritized, right? And so the issue then becomes, how are we going to prioritize it? What does it mean? Let's try and see if we can use the same model. And these are some of the challenges. So, what has come out is that, the cost allocations are not correct, the tariff methodology is not correct, the political risk perception is also not correct. And in some cases, it may or may not be fair, but these are the things that investors are looking at when they want to invest in these kinds of projects. And I think these are the things that need to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed not only at the regulatory level, but it also needs to be addressed at the government level. So I think there are also, in terms of governance, there are issues, and it's been mentioned before. I think it was mentioned actually yesterday from the GridWorks team, is that because this is, considerably a nascent segment when it comes to private sector participation, there is a lot of upfront work and commitment that governments have to also undertake. They have to show the commitment by doing the things that are necessary to give comfort for private investment, because private investment follows the easiest path. And so if they are comfortable that things will be predictable, reliable, they trust the country, then they will invest in that country. So there is a lot of upfront work that needs to be done. And one of the things I just wanted to mention, I don't know if it's taking us off track, but the other thing is the issue of the support from government. And in particular, in terms of financial support, considering what we have all been through in the past couple of years, a lot of countries are really kind of vying away from that kind of, guarantee structure, etc. And this is what actually we got from the presentation from Brazil, is that there was that government structure. And so we need to also appreciate that governments need to be able to provide that, to give additional comfort, especially since this is a nascent market. So there is that need also for that government commitment, the government financial commitment in whatever form it takes, to be able to enable this to happen.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Rhoda, for making that critical point. I had it in the back of my mind as well, but I was trying to stick to the key regulatory topics, but I agree that it's a fundamental topic that also needs to be brought to the table for this model to really kick off. Peter, do you have anything to add on in terms of insights from the risk perspective? You are on mute. Sorry, you can't hear you.
Sorry, Rita. Adding that the other risks that need to be looked at, which concern the private sector, is really the perceived expropriation and nationalization of transmission assets. Of course, the transmission is typically perceived to be a sovereign asset that guarantees energy security. And even when there is a function, that system operation can remain in the hands of the government, and then the infrastructure itself is remunerated through a regulatory mechanism. I think there is still a high perception that in Africa there is a likelihood that once the assets are deployed and nuts are bolted, there could be expropriation of certain assets, and I think that increases the cost of capital on the continent. The other one risk is the regulatory uncertainty. Of course, there are unclear regulatory frameworks that can deter the private, of course, investments, and all this is seen through the kind of level of governance, substance, and impact assessments that, for example, the African Development Bank has done through its ERI, which give a mirror of the kind of level of development of regulatory institutions and how capable they are to actually consistently implement and enforce certain standards that need to be. I mentioned earlier on around the cost recovery mechanism would reward the returns to the private capital deployed in the huge segment of capex that is involved in the infrastructure segment, and this need to be consistently really reflected in the pricing methodologies, so that there is no tinkering or change in the rules of the game. So that there is that certainty over the long-term period within which the IPTs, the TPs apply. Then again, the rate of return, which is commonly methodology, which is commonly used in Africa, really needs to be grounded and enforced consistently, because oftentimes we see regulators changing the rules. They're not consistent of applying the methodologies, agreeing certain returns in 1 year, one periodic review, and then in another periodic review, say after 5 years, they want to change the games. And that kind of, for private sector who's sought money from the commercial markets over a long-term debt tenor period, it kind of creates an imbalance in how they refinance their debt and the period within which they recover that money. Then there would be interconnection standards, and this links especially to the cross-border power trade, or even as we see more African countries trying to liberalize their market and encourage bilateral contracts or even day-ahead markets. So the kind of interconnection standards between what an IPP builds and what the other country builds in say Namibia and what Tanzania is building, that consistency in having uniform standards that can adequately enable the flow of electrons from one region to the other needs to be regulated and standardized. Otherwise, it creates kind of reliability disincentive to the people involved in power trade. I think there is a more modern security and risk that relates to cybersecurity and data protection concerns. And it's I'm sure regulators and system operators are starting to look at this. This is an emerging issue that IPTs would need to look at. I know they would have all the protection mechanism embedded within their agreements with the sovereigns. However, I think regulators need to look at this critically, especially as AI becomes a more dominant feature using in managing energy flows. And lastly, I think as an IPT, I would prefer to have certainty around long-term planning and how coordination of this planning is done centrally or within the system operator house. So those would be some of my key risks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Harold, I see that you've unmuted yourself, so I see that you're dying to react. So please go ahead.
Not quite. Maybe your question will come after, but I also wanted to add on the risk, and specifically to just give that confidence and that comfort that in terms of the bedrock that we are looking at, the principles are not going to differ so much. However, they have to be contextualized. But by this, what do I mean? Ultimately, for IPTs, because they are new, remember every risk is ultimately going to result into a price factor, positive or negative. So as we think through, let's give an example of, say, a transboundary, cross-boundary project. The risks of land in one country are totally going to be different from the risks of land in another country. And those things have to be factored in for the respective country. So this is where we begin to see differences. But there are certain things which are still not going to remain negotiable. Issues on the financial security, issues on the payment, those are going to remain standardized across the countries. So where you're going to have differences are some of those things which are peculiar to your specific utilities. The other thing that ultimately you have to think through in terms of risk is in terms of who is actually, of course, going to bear it, and is it a fair allocation? Because there are real questions in terms of the lessons that we have learned across IPP. And now, these being IPTs, do we have the same confidence that if we take those same risks and apply them in equal measure to IPTs, okay? Like say, if as a company I've been consistent in paying my utility bills and the generation companies are fine, should we have that same risk equally being priced almost the same to an IPP or an IPT, or the IPT is going to be looked at completely differently because it is novel? The reason I'm raising that is that these are real questions on what benefits have we learned from our track record as IPPs that we can actually transpose to our IPPs, specifically in terms of de-risking the IPT sector and giving confidence to lenders, giving confidence to private actors who are coming into these nascent economies that we can do equally much better in the IPTs. So you'll have those divergences coming in terms of issues of land, but also in terms of the type of the project. What we have seen, for instance, is naturally the risk profile of a brownfield project is not going to be the same risk profile for a greenfield project. For instance, the brownfield is not going to acquire land. They're not going to take certain risks. But then for a greenfield, they're going to have to acquire land. They're going to have to acquire way-leaves. They're going to provide different kind of warranties and also the kind of assets that you're putting in place. Are you putting in place substations? Are you putting in place point-to-point transmission lines? These divergences then begin to speak to the kind of project that you are specifically doing now. Now, that said, I don't think risk for all of us as regulators, as lenders, as financiers, and thought leaders should be a disabler. It is something that we have to address, and someone has got to be able to start stepping into the murky waters. Maybe along the way, as you step into the river, it will become clearer. But the longer we spend our time on the shores looking at and not crossing this river, the more turbulent it actually becomes, or seemingly becomes. So there has got to be a boldness to actually move and not let risk actually inhibit our application of some of these solutions, because the need is actually there. For me, I do a back of the hand calculation. What's the cost benefit analysis? How does the public benefit from this? And if it is positive, as regulators, as lenders, as financiers, as thought leaders, we then plunge in deep.
Thank you very much, Harold, for that very pertinent precision and addition and contribution. I think maybe a question to all of you, because we've been talking about many things, and I think you mentioned that, I mean, risks, of course, it's important to be aware of them and to see how to mitigate them on a project-specific basis. And of course, there's a direct correlation in terms of the cost of capital and the pricing. But a lot can be done also from a regulatory perspective to lower those risks and to therefore establish an environment that is conducive to more investment. So I think I would like to ask the three of you, maybe if you can focus on 2 or 3 key interventions or requirements in the regulatory framework and environment that would be conducive to these investments. What would you highlight? And maybe we'll start with Rhoda.
Thank you, Rita. I think for me, the main messages, especially from the past 2 days that we've had, I think one of the key things is using the ITP model doesn't need to be complicated, right? So I think it's one of those things, the way that we were able to address the regulatory gaps for generation is the same way that we should approach now transmission in terms of attracting private investment. So for me, what I would say is regulations need to look at licensing. Let's see where we are in terms of the policy framework for licensing. And then also looking at the tariff methodologies. We've already identified as the bank that the tariff methodology is not commensurate, and it's something that already has been discussed by everyone during this conference. So it's something that we need to really kind of delve into, is how is the cost allocation done and how is that tariff methodology set up when it comes to transmission investments.
Thank you very much, Rhoda. Peter? Still on mute.
Right. My first takeaway is that IPTs are very much needed in Africa as an alternative mechanism and model to find the much needed transmission infrastructure. And also considering the fact that governments are nearing their debt limits, and of course on the background of the backdrop of the COVID pandemic that's happened recently, so their kind of budgets stripped. So there is need to look at explore alternative models of funding this necessary transmission infrastructure. Secondly, there is need for incentives for building necessary transmission infrastructure. And these are really performance-based regulation incentives for IPTs. And this can easily be used to blend within the traditional regulatory frameworks for transmission companies. Then the other one is actually clearly ring-fencing revenues for transmission networks. And this refers to rewarding, giving an appropriate return to the high fixed costs and involved in the transmission assets, which actually are non-substitutable, and therefore they should have adequate compensation arrangements. Lastly is to do away with the wheeling framework or wheeling arrangements, because wheeling power from point A to B does not necessarily reflect the actual cost of network usage. So if the network is substantially used in point A, then the users should actually pay for the network use in that particular location rather than wheeling power from one point A to point B. So I would say wheeling frameworks and the current way they are used need to be revised so they can actually provide a complementary mechanism for IPTs. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Harold?
My 2 things that I think regulators need to clarify on pretty much what Peter and Rhoda have said, which is really licensing and tariffs. Licensing, because it's got to give clarity on who is going to do what in the electricity sector network. How do you interact, and how ultimately do you come in, but also how do you get out as an IPT, and what are the, because this is long-term infrastructure that we are talking about. That has got to be very clear. And as if we are talking of licensing, we also have to be very clear in terms of the procurement of these IPTs. Is it going to be done in an unsolicited manner, or is it going to be done competitively? In all honesty, there are benefits of both. It's not, I don't think we should be quick to write off one and say, oh, the best way to go is auctioning, because we have seen some auctions not deliver in the generation segment. We don't want to go for a critical line and then it takes 5 to 10 years and it's being done by an IPT. That would really spell the death of a very good process. The other one, of course, which we need clarity on is which regulators can actually be able to do is the tariffs, and giving that financial certainty that at the end of the day, when an IPT actually invests in a sector, they have guaranteed revenues for this period of time, for this duration. And I think preferably if that can honestly be passed on to the end users, and you have a very efficient collecting system all the way to the distribution segment, I think that would be a key driver for IPTs, because consumers are quick to pay, I think, for a need and a benefit that they actually see with not so much hindrance than when there is completely nothing on the ground for them. Those are my two things that I think that regulators should strive to actually give clarity. Reason being, the others technical standards, they're pretty much standard. You're not going to argue over the specifications of a transformer, over the specifications of a line. I don't think they have changed in the last couple of years for a significant period. So you're going to haggle more on some of the other issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harold. And I think we're starting to wrap up, but I think you brought up a very important topic that none of us had mentioned before, but I think procurement is absolutely key. And I think it links as well to one of the issues that Rhoda mentioned in the beginning in terms of institutional capacity, governance frameworks. I wonder if Peter and Rhoda want to say something about procurement just before we start to really wrap up the session. Since I don't think we have questions from the audience, it's a very quiet audience, so we can use the few minutes we have left to cover this.
Okay, so I'll go first. I think in terms of procurement, it really depends also on the governance structure of each country. But what we have found in terms of experience is that auctions are always better, right? And so I think in terms of procurement, the auction approach has always yielded better results in terms of lowering the cost of the investment, as well as also bringing in more innovation, because you have that competitive framework that has already been established. So that would be my takeaway on that.
Thank you, Rhoda. Peter, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's important that procurement is initiated timely, and that's transparently conducted, and that's actually delivers the intended objectives, which is delivering electrons to the wider population that remains unserved. But also transparent procurement, of course, helps to reveal the efficient prices from various competitors. So for the benefit of the consumers that ultimately pay the tariff, it's important that we get the most optimal bid, and that this bid reflects a value that will actually benefit consumers. Oftentimes the procurement is conducted under the table between the ministers or the executives of the countries and result in inefficient prices. So I would call on regulators to actually intervene as soon as certain investors come to table their bids for IPTs or come to propose certain solutions. Because at the end of the day, you pay either through the tariff or through increased taxes. So there's no way out of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter and Rhoda, for those final insights. It's been a real pleasure talking to the three of you and hearing your invaluable insights. I think if I can summarize in the couple of minutes that we have left before handing back to Daniela, I think the key themes that were highlighted by all of you in terms of pushing for the first and foremost, the importance of the independent transmission project as a key pathway to attract private investment in the transmission. I think that would be the first key takeaway. Then the second is really a focus on getting right the licensing aspect is to reduce those risks, and also the tariff methodology is absolutely critical to enable this. And then I think the point that came late in the game, but also important, the procurement to enhance the, as Rhoda mentioned, the low cost and the innovations and the technical performance standards that are important for the reliability of the service. Thank you very much. And Daniela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rita. I'd like to thank our moderators and our distinguished panelists for the very insightful conversations we've been having this afternoon. Thank you to our participants for their questions, and we hope to see you tomorrow on the final day of this 3-day conference. We'll continue the conversation with first a wrap-up from Professor Ignacio. So if you've missed the first 2 days or the first day, please be there tomorrow, and we'll continue with next steps then. Thank you so much, and have a great afternoon, evening, morning. Bye-bye.